They say every fairy tale has a grain of truth buried in it sometimes. The grain is as sharp as glass, hidden deep beneath layers of soot and sorrow. You know the story. A beautiful young girl, mistreated by her wicked stepmother and cruel stepsisters, earns her place in the world through a touch of magic. What if the very act of fitting the slipper is a symbol of something far more sinister? Perhaps the origins of Cinderella's rise to royalty are not bathed in moonlight, but stained in blood echoing ancient rituals that stretch back further than we can imagine. A glass slipper, fragile and delicate, becomes the key to her salvation, a fairy godmother whispers. In the shadows, a prince arrives, as if summoned by fate itself. But what if that slipper is not a symbol of pure love or fairy tale romance? What if it's something darker? Today you will hear a story of how innocence was never a part of this legend. A fairy godmother, glowing with an otherworldly light, appeared in the garden. The prince, taken by her at once, danced with her the entire night, unable to take his eyes off her. But as the night wore on, the magic began to fade, the clock's warning echoed through the palace, and Cinderella fled, leaving behind one of her glass slippers, the prince. Desperate to find the mysterious maiden, searched the kingdom far and wide. He came upon Cinderella's home, and when her stepsisters failed to fit the slipper, Cinderella, revealing her true identity, slipped her foot into the delicate glass. It fit perfectly. She was the one, with a flick of her wand. She transformed Cinderella's rags into a gown of silken splendor, her shoes into sparkling glass slippers. "Go," the fairy whispered. "You may go, but remember, when the clock strikes midnight, all will return to the way it was. The version you know is the one handed down through centuries of retellings, charming, simple, and neat. A tale of magic, love, and destiny." But even as the story of Cinderella continues to be told, buried beneath the polished glass of her slipper is something darker. Something ancient, and to uncover it, we must dig deeper past the surface of what you think you know, into the shadows of history, folklore, and forgotten rituals of how the ancient world's darkest rituals were woven into the fabric of a story so beloved, yet so misunderstood. A grand ball was to be held at the palace, and all the young women of the kingdom were invited, with the hope that one of them might win the heart of the prince. Cinderella's stepsisters were ecstatic, tearing through her meager belongings, demanding that she help them prepare. All the while, they laughed at her, knowing she would never be invited. And by the end, you will see Cinderella's glass slipper in a new, horrifying light. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, there was a young girl named Cinderella. Her life was a miserable one. And when she stood there so delicate and quiet, it was as though she were untouched by the darkness around her. She became the servant of her own home, a mere shadow of the girl she once was. After the untimely death of her mother, her father remarried a woman whose cruelty seemed to match her beauty. Cinderella's stepmother had two daughters of her own, spoiled, entitled, and every bit as wicked as their mother. They made Cinderella's life unbearable, forcing her to do all the chores, mocking her at every turn, and locking her away in a dusty attic room. But Cinderella was different. There was something about her, an ethereal beauty, a grace in the way she moved, in the way she never fought back. One day, a royal invitation arrived. But on the eve of the ball, a miracle happened. At the ball, Cinderella's beauty was unparalleled. And so the prince took her to his palace, and they lived happily ever after. But this is only the surface of the story. We're only just beginning to see the true, bloody origins of Cinderella's rise. The version of Cinderella you know is not the original. Oh, it bears echoes of the past, faint whispers of something older, much darker. The earliest known roots of Cinderella can be found in ancient China, long before the brothers Grimm or Charles Perrault added their pens to the myth. In fact, the oldest surviving version of the story dates back to the 9th century in the Chinese story Yixian. A young girl named Yixian is mistreated by her stepmother and stepsister. The symbolism of the shoe is a key to unlocking the deeper layers of this ancient myth. In many early versions of the story, the shoe was not just a perfect fit, it was a ritualized object, a key to entering a new world. It is a reflection of ancient rituals and beliefs that predate even the written word, rituals that demanded sacrifice, purity, and often blood. The shoe wasn't merely a romantic symbol. It represented the crossing of a threshold, an irreversible transformation, but aided by a magical fish, not a fairy godmother. She attends a festival where the king is struck by her beauty. The origins of Cinderella's story, her rise to royalty, are bound to something ancient, something much older than even these first known versions. But as we transition into the fairy tale realm, it becomes glass. Why glass? The material is fragile, so fragile that it can break easily, representing the precariousness of social mobility and the fragility of fate itself. Cinderella's transformation is not one of mere personal growth, it is an act of submission to an ancient, ritualistic order, a form of ascension that is tied to a power beyond her, one that she can neither control nor understand. In this version, the king's desire is the catalyst for Yixian's rise, not the love of a prince, but the core remains the same, a girl in rags rising to royalty through some form of supernatural aid. In truth, the tale of a beautiful girl rising from servitude to royalty is one of the oldest motifs in folklore. Whether it be the cruel stepsisters trying to force their own feet into the glass slipper, or Cinderella herself stepping into a world that is far more dangerous and unforgiving than she can imagine. Any of the earliest European versions was penned by the Italian author Giambattista Bossel in his Pentamerone collection of fairy tales that predates the Grimms by hundreds of years. Here, Cinderella's name is Zaziella, and the story is one of cruelty, darkness, and even sexual undertones, instead of a fairy godmother. She receives help from a dove sent by her late mother's spirit, but not before enduring horrifying treatment. Her stepsisters, rather than simply being rivals, are violent, bloodthirsty figures, and the magical shoe is a golden one, symbolic of wealth and power. In one particularly grisly scene, the stepsisters, desperate to fit into the shoe, hack off their toes and heels, leading to a brutal, bloody ending for them. It spans across cultures and centuries, and the earliest versions, far from being filled with glittering magic and romantic promises, are steeped in grimness and blood. To trace this tale back, we must first step into the murkier waters of history in the West. The tale begins to take shape around the 16th century. Then, of course, we have Charles Perrault's Cinderella in 1697, which is the version most of us know today, graceful, romantic, and tragic. His tale is the one that introduces the now iconic glass slipper, the fairy godmother, and the magical carriage, but here lies the first subtle shift from the darker, ancient roots of the story. Perrault made the choice to sanitize it, to remove the cruelty and replace it with something more palatable to the growing middle-class audiences of 17th century France. However, beneath the surface, the darker edges of the tale were still very much present. The transformation of Cinderella from a humble girl into a princess was not just about beauty or virtue, it was about a metaphorical fitting. She had to fit the slipper, just as she had to fit the social order. Why, you might wonder, would Cinderella's rise involve such violent imagery, from mutilated feet to the grisly fate of her stepsisters? What does it all mean? In the Pentamerone, the shoe is golden, perhaps indicating a connection to the sun or celestial power. Thus, the story of Cinderella is no innocent fairy tale. It is a metaphor for something much darker and older, the story in all its forms. Is a warning a metaphor for the societal structures that demand a certain fit? But this is only a glimpse. We are still standing at the threshold. There is more beneath the surface. The origins of Cinderella's story, her rise to royalty, are bound to something ancient, something much older than even these first known versions. Let us now peer beyond the veil of glass into the deeper shadows of what this story truly represents. What is Cinderella, really? Who or what does she stand for in the collective psyche? What does the glass slipper symbolize, if not mere romantic destiny? The tale of Cinderella is, at its core, a story of transformation, but not in the way you might think. It is not merely about a humble girl rising to royalty, but about the desperate, often brutal attempt to fit into a world that demands conformity. In some versions, the stepsisters are not just rivals, they are monstrous. They are not evil in the traditional sense, but are rather symbolic of the forces that cling to tradition, to societal order, to conformity. They are symbols of the old, oppressive order refusing to let go of their control over Cinderella. Even as she is whisked away to a new life, their desperation to fit into a mold that was never meant for them is a brutal image of how people can cling to a system that refuses to bend, no matter the cost. Their attempts to fit into the slipper, to be chosen, represent the impossible demands of these systems. The prince, too, is a reflection of the archetype of the divine ruler, the one who chooses, not the one who is chosen. He is not the transformative force Cinderella is. He simply recognizes her as the one who fits. But as we shall see, his role is not just to choose, but to enforce the cosmic order, to ensure that the system of fate, of purity, of perfection, remains intact. They cut themselves, mutilating their own feet in their desperate bid for acceptance, but the slipper does not fit them. And in the world of the fairy tale, selection is everything. The world they seek to join is not theirs to inhabit. The glass slipper is the perfect symbol of this process, a delicate object, fragile and exclusive, created to fit only one foot. Their violence mutilating themselves to fit into the prescribed order is a metaphor for the struggle against societal norms. For the pain of those who are forced to fit into roles not of their making, it is a symbol of purity, but also of isolation. For the one who wears it is both elevated and marked. In many ancient cultures, rites of passage were brutal, involving tests of endurance, purity, and sometimes mutilation. The tale of Cinderella, with its broken feet and severed toes, echoes this long-lost tradition of transformation through pain, the stepsisters' bloody attempts to force their feet into the glass slipper are not just desperate, they are sacrificial. They are the price paid for the attempt to transcend their lower status. In one sense, the slipper is a sign of marriage, a perfect union between Cinderella and the prince, yet the slipper is to perfect, its glass surface to fragile. The shoe is not just a match. It is a token of a deeper, cosmic order, a system that demands purity, exactness, and perfection. And like all systems that demand perfection, it carries with it an unspoken violence. The slipper, pristine and fragile, is also a warning. The world it represents is a world that leaves no room for imperfection. She is chosen, but in a way that makes her irrevocably different, perhaps even outcast in her difference. What is it about Cinderella's character that makes her the chosen one? In the most traditional versions of the tale, she is the embodiment of virtue, the pure and innocent girl who suffers, but never retaliates. In mythological terms, Cinderella is the virgin archetype, innocent, untouched, and waiting for an external force to awaken her into a new world. This is not unique to her tale. In fact, it mirrors the story of Persephone, the Greek goddess who is kidnapped by Hades and taken into the underworld, only to rise again as a queen. It echoes the Norse myth of Idun, the goddess of youth, whose apples grant immortality. Both of these goddesses were innocent in the beginning, but their fates were transformed by forces outside themselves, forces that ultimately shape their roles in the mythological cycles. Like Cinderella, these figures did not choose their path, they were chosen, this idea of suffering and passivity, of waiting for fate to deliver salvation, is key to understanding the symbolic weight of the story. Cinderella's virtue is not active or empowered, it is something imposed upon her. She is not the agent of her own change, it is the intervention of the supernatural, the fairy godmother, the magical fish, the dove, or whatever form it takes that transforms her. This theme of passive transformation echoes an ancient archetypal struggle. But what of the stepsisters? What of the cruelty and the bloodshed that often stains their place in the story? Here, in these actions, we see something darker, a reflection of a world that punishes those who attempt to forcibly change their fates or bend the rules of destiny. In these versions of the tale, the stepsisters become the ones who resist transformation. Now, take another step back. What is the symbolism of the shoe itself? What does it really mean for it to fit perfectly? There is something very ancient in this. Something connected to the rites of passage, to sacrifices made in order to enter a new realm. And what of the prince? That figure who appears so mysteriously, almost as if summoned by destiny. The prince's power lies not in his ability to love, but in his ability to select. Now, let us reach into the deepest strata of time, beyond the fractured surface of folklore and myth. To truly understand Cinderella's rise, we must understand the ancient worlds from which these stories arise, worlds where blood, magic, and fate were inseparable. Worlds where myths like Cinderella's were not merely tales, but rituals. Rituals that bound people to forces far beyond their comprehension. Long before glass slippers and royal balls, the archetypes found in Cinderella existed in the mists of prehistory. The Indo-European peoples, who stretched from the ancient Celtic tribes in the west to the Vedic cultures of the east, carried within them stories of transformation, sacrifice, and rebirth. The Minoans, with their complex rituals surrounding fertility, death, and transformation, often used symbolic objects in their rites, items like shoes, rings, and veils, all of which were linked to purity, sexuality, and rebirth. These objects were often used in rituals to mark the passage from one state of being to another. The gods were not kind or merciful, but exacting and demanding. They required sacrifice, and often demanded that one give up something of oneself in order to gain a new life. The idea that only those who fit into the prescribed roles, who endure the trials of life, will ascend to a higher status is as present now as it was in the ancient world. The story of Cinderella, that tale we've heard since childhood, is not the light-hearted fantasy we once believed it to be. It is a dark reflection of the world's oldest fears, of the ancient rituals that governed transformation, sacrifice, and the harsh demands of fate. To conform to an ancient order, where fate is shaped by forces beyond your control, and where the perfect fit is both a gift and a curse. The glass slipper is no mere trinket, it is a symbol of a world that has always demanded perfection, and punished those who could not fit the mold. They are us. They are the ones who cannot fit into the worlds that demand perfection. A warning of what happens when we are forced to fit into a system that demands too much. A system that takes the most fragile parts of us and bends them until they break. The ones who are broken by the very system that calls for purity. Their violence, their blood, is the price of their failure to conform. And perhaps that is the darkest part of Cinderella's tale, the truth that we are all forced to confront. Some stories are written in glass, and no matter how hard we try, our feet will never fit. To fit to align perfectly with a predetermined destiny is to give up a part of yourself. It is to submit to a system that demands more than you can give, and yet rewards you with a crown, a throne, a life of riches. What happens when the clock strikes midnight and the world we've created for ourselves shatters at our feet? The slipper will fit, but at what cost? The stories you know, those tales of innocence and fairy tale endings, are more ancient and more twisted than you could ever have imagined. But the question remains, what other tales have we yet to uncover? What lies beneath the surface is something darker and more dangerous than we have yet explored. The glass slipper is not just a fairy tale object. It is the symbol of a system that demands perfection, a system that has existed since the dawn of civilization. It is here, in the intersection of divine power and human suffering, where Cinderella's story is rooted. The idea of a girl fitting into an object that marked her transformation was central to these rites, and the loss of all they knew in order to claim a new life. Her story is not one of happily ever after, it is one of submission, of sacrifice, of becoming something else entirely. The prince, the glass slipper, the ball, they are not the true elements of her ascension. The true force that shapes her destiny is something far darker, hidden in the shadows of her transformation. The glass slipper, in a sense, is a reimagining of this ancient symbolic act. It is both a gift and a burden, a key to a world where purity, power, and transformation are intertwined. The process of crossing over into a new world, a new identity, required trials, suffering, and sometimes even mutilation. In many Indo-European cultures, young women would undergo trials that involved severe hardships, testing their ability to survive, to endure pain, and to emerge transformed. In ancient Germanic and Celtic traditions, for example, girls would undergo blood rituals designed to prove their worthiness and transition into adulthood. In these cultures, the young woman's status was defined not by her beauty alone, but by her strength in facing these rituals, just as Cinderella's strength is not derived from her beauty, but from her ability to survive, to endure, and to ultimately ascend to a new, higher position. The idea of fitting was central to this, as the individual had to prove their worthiness by matching the demands of the world they sought to enter. These stories were not simply for children, they were sacred. The cosmic order that the shoe represents has endured across cultures, echoing through the millennia. The glass slipper, whether a golden shoe or a fragile crystal, is a token of a world that demands conformity, purity, and sacrifice. The young initiate, often a girl coming of age, had to undergo a period of trial. Sometimes this meant facing the Dark Mother, an older figure who tested the initiate's purity, strength, and endurance. In other myths, such as those of the Minoans and Hittites, girls were symbolically married to the gods in rituals of transformation, often through symbolic objects like shoes. The very act of stepping into a divine order was an act of sacrifice. They were about entering new realms, about changing the course of one's fate through both suffering and divine intervention. The rite of passage, an essential part of nearly every ancient culture, was not a light-hearted affair. It was often brutal and deeply symbolic. One of the most ancient rites, still alive in some parts of the world, is the initiation. In the ancient cultures of the Near East, where civilization itself was born, the mythological archetypes that would later feed into Cinderella's story were already well-formed. Take the Sumerian myth of Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility, who descends into the underworld. Her descent, akin to Cinderella's fall into servitude, is one of humiliation, suffering, and purification. Inanna must surrender her royal garments and symbolically strip herself of her power to be reborn. The cycle of descent and return, of losing oneself to gain a new identity, is mirrored in Cinderella's transformation. But Inanna's return is marked by the restoration of her power, just as Cinderella's return is marked by her royal ascent. But it is the Minoan civilization that offers perhaps the clearest link to the ancient roots of Cinderella's tale. These rites of passage were not simply symbolic. They were real. At the same time, these ancient rites were often tied to the gods, the divine figures who both gave and took away power. As we move from the ancient to the modern, we see how the basic elements of Cinderella's tale have evolved, but the underlying principles remain unchanged. Even today, the archetype of the perfect fit remains woven into the fabric of society. Now, as we draw the tale to a close, take a moment to reflect on the journey we've taken together. Cinderella's rise is not a romantic ascent. It is a passage through suffering, a ritual in which the innocent must endure pain, the mutilation of identity. What, then, does it mean to fit the slipper? To become something that was never meant for you? Perhaps Cinderella's story is not just one of transformation, but of the price we all pay for wanting to transcend our station, to rise above the forces that seek to bind us to our original form. And what of the stepsisters, whose feet were too large, whose hearts too full of anger and envy? In the end, perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the story of Cinderella is not just a tale. It is a warning. And so, with the glass slipper still gleaming in the dark, we are left with a final question: what happens when the magic wears off? But even as we end this chapter, know that this is only the beginning. The slipper may fit, but the cost of wearing it is far greater than we have dared to understand. This concludes our journey into Cinderella's bloody rise. The tale, once innocent, is now revealed in all its mythic and horrific grandeur. Stay with us, for the shadows are long and the stories are endless.